All right, fantastic, guys. So, welcome to the webinar for in-house creatives, put together by our lovely marketing team here. Um, so, basically, guys, what we're going to be going over today is kind of an overview of what we've seen from a lot of in-house agencies and some of the pain points that they face, and then some kind of potential workarounds, some things that we can do to, make life a little bit easier for the people that we're working with and for our own teams. So just to get started here, guys, let me just run you through the agenda. So I'm going to give you guys a quick intro just of myself. We're going to go through some of the findings that we've had from internal agencies over the past little bit. We can talk about one of the largest pain points that we've seen for people in the creative industry or in the internal agency space. And then we've got some kind of tips and tricks of things that we can do to kind of get the team working together and working to the beat of one drum, for lack of a better term. At the end of that, guys, we're going to have room for some questions, so please feel free to either throw those into the GoToMeeting chat area, or feel free to speak up at the end of this, and we can do some Q&A. All right, guys. So I guess a little bit about myself, considering we're going to be spending the next half hour together. I'm the customer success lead here at Function Point. So with that, what I bring is over 9 years of training experience. I've had the opportunity to work with well over 70 agencies, getting them up and running. I've worked with lots of different project managers, creative directors, and traffic managers throughout that time. So I've been able to gather quite a bit of insight from what those different sort of stakeholders experience when they're going through jobs. I've also had the opportunity to work with some fairly large agencies in the internal agency sphere, so groups like John Hancock, Manulife, Inner Workings. So what I'm hoping is that, with that experience, I'm able to give you guys a bit of insight into what we've noticed here, and again, kind of walk you guys through a couple tips and tricks that we can do to make things flow a little bit smoother. Now you'll notice the guitar in that picture. Obviously, guys, the theme of this whole thing is getting people kind of harmonizing, getting people working together, kind of like playing as a part of a band. So that's a little bit from my background. I do play a bit of music, so if you guys hear any bad music puns throughout, I apologize. Or if you love them, let me know, and I'll try to send you guys a list of them after the fact. All right, so folks, let's take a look at some findings that we've noticed from in-house agencies, just with the different people that we've chatted to. So a few key things that come up all the time when we're chatting with people in the internal sphere is that just because we've got one major client, i.e. the person that we are employed by, it doesn't mean there's any less work. So when we take a look at a traditional sort of external agency, so we've got a group that's working with many different clients outside, certainly there's lots of jobs coming in, but it really does kind of pale in comparison to what the in-house teams get tasked with. So what we've seen is, on average, most of our internal agencies that we work with, they're doing anywhere from between 1,000 and 2,000 projects per year. So that's obviously a lot of work. With each of those projects, we need to make sure that there's obviously definition and resourcing, making sure that we're putting the right people on the job, and as well making sure that we actually have the internal resources necessary to complete that job. So really what this whole webinar is focusing on is trying to get everybody together to make sure everyone's singing the same tune. Now, we have obviously kind of throughout our research and chatting with lots of different internal agencies, we've determined that, there is one real main point that really does tend to slow people down. However, I'd be really curious to hear from some of you guys sitting on the line what you think the top issue for most in-house agencies is. So if you guys want to throw something into the chat box there, maybe something that you've encountered that might be, or that you think might be a big issue for most internal agencies, that would be great. I'll give you a few seconds to throw that in the chat box if you can. All right. So let's see here. So I've got a question from, let's see here, Chris Racher. So what's the best way to get all the stakeholders around the table at the brief stage? Guys, that actually kind of does feed into this. So kind of getting people together initially to make sure that we have everything sort of outlined before we start the job. So that does lead directly into what we've noticed to be the main sort of issue that internal agencies have, and that is scope creep. So scope creep being, at least from our perspective here, we start off a piece of work thinking it's going to take X amount of resources, X amount of hours, and then kind of that project continues to grow. So maybe we've got people kind of leaning over the desk saying, hey, could you just add this to this job? Could you just add this deliverable? Things can quickly get out of hand fast. So really, that's what we're going to be going through and talking about some ways that we can mitigate that. Chris, one thing that you mentioned there is during the brief stage. That is something we're going to focus on today. So from what we've seen, everybody, the big things that happen with scope creep, obviously it destroys our planning. So if we're fielding thousands of requests throughout the course of the year, we need to be as accurate as possible in terms of our resourcing. When we're trying to do that resourcing, if we don't have all the right information at the very beginning, it makes it very difficult to get a good picture of what we actually need to provide. If we keep kind of adding to that scope, obviously that starts taking a turn on the available resources that are able to do that work, which obviously leads to a bit of disharmony within the team. If not everybody knows what everyone's doing, or if people are kind of struggling and scrambling to get involved with different pieces of work because it's grown so much, can definitely make for a little out of tune environment, for lack of a better term. Obviously, if not everyone's working in the same tune, or if we're just kind of scrambling to get things done, it gives us a time crunch. I'm sure all of you guys know as creatives, if you're feeling pretty crunched to get something done, it makes it really hard to produce that work that's going to make everybody say, wow. So, I mean, if I'm going to use a musical analogy for this, there's a big difference between having a song that, has a lot of heart that goes into it, than having something that's maybe just 3 chords, dead simple, and really just kind of feels generic. People notice the same thing with the work that we're providing. So if the work that we're doing is really kind of rushed just because we don't have time to field all the requests, I guess that rush or that lack of time is really going to be reflected in some of that work. And just kind of wrapping that up, guys. I mean, if we are working on thousands of projects per year, do we really have the time to deviate from our plans? Probably not. So guys, this is where we kind of come into, I guess, 3 things that we've noticed that will really kind of get your team working on the same page. The first one of which is getting that contract signed. So Chris, again, to come back to your point there, making sure that we have some sort of brief in place, some sort of contract between ourselves and the people that are actually asking for the work to get done. Now, this can take the point of a brief template. So possibly we have something kind of sitting around internally that is a fully fleshed out questionnaire that we'd run through with everybody that's requesting the work from us. Now, trying to get people to sit around the table at that stage, I know it can be difficult for sure. And on the best of days, it might be tough to kind of wrangle everybody in. So usually what I recommend with this is that, on our brief templates, we're being very, very specific about what we're looking for and being very specific about the expectations as well. What I've seen in the past is, a lot of different agencies, they'll create their brief templates to be incredibly detailed. So really kind of gathering every little bit of information that could potentially be needed for that job, but then making a few of the fields required. So, obviously different project management systems will deal with that differently. The way that I've seen that done, there's the ability to add kind of that asterisk on different fields on the template, which makes that required. If we're using paper versions, it might be as simple as just setting the expectation with our requesters as well as our team that, yes, we've got a lot of information here. However, if these 2 or 3 key points are not filled in, So the things that we need to at least provide that minimum viable product for people, that brief essentially gets returned to the other team. So kind of setting that initial expectation and being very firm with it, that's a great way to kind of get everybody involved in the job. And if we do have those stakeholders that aren't able to be there at that point, we've at least got a written record for them. A good point here is kind of treating that brief like a contract. What I've seen a lot of people do in the past, and this can be a downfall sometimes, is that they'll have every best intention about using one of those brief templates or using a brief, but when there's any sort of pushback against that, people will tend not to follow through. Another good point here, guys, is almost using a change log. So when we notice that, we potentially have any sort of changes to the scope of our work, what we can sometimes do is actually create another sort of questionnaire, another sort of form in our system that keeps track of any of those changes. So if I had job A, for instance, that brief request had come in and we'd agreed to a scope of work that's maybe going to take 10 hours. If we have to boost that up from 10 to 15, we're using another form just to keep track of that information, to log those changes. And then at the end of the day, what we have is that initial request that kind of shows where the job was, all the details about what changes took place during that job itself, and then the end product. So it's kind of a nice way for us to, for lack of a better term, do a post-mortem on that job. And then just making sure that everybody's involved. So, when you do get those brief templates in, just making sure that we're communicating that to the right people. Now, guys, we actually do have a couple examples here of creative briefs that we actually use in our system. So this is something that we're going to be sending out to everybody on the webinar after we're finished here today. But certainly, if you do have any further questions about these, you can feel free to email me. I'll make sure that my email address is included, and I can, potentially walk people through some of these other briefs that I've seen in the past. Now, guys, I just want to check in with everybody. Is everyone still able to hear me okay? Someone could just throw a quick little comment into the question box there. Perfect. All right, guys, now another great step here, and this is something that, we really try to encourage as much as possible with our own internal marketing team, is communicating like a promoter. So, guys, really what we mean here is that, we're going to be chatting a lot with the people that are requesting the piece of work from us. We're always kind of tooting our own horn, and that's great, as we should be. Sometimes what we forget to do is communicate with, the other stakeholders or the people that are on our team. Now, we know that life in an internal agency can get incredibly busy, incredibly fast. That's one of the main reasons we're talking about scope creep. You guys have a lot of stuff coming in continually, but making sure that we have that clear, consistent communication, and really just kind of over communicating any of those changes to the job, as well as what was initially requested. So if I've got a team of 4 or 5 people working on a specific project, maybe that project lead is making sure that that brief is completely filled in and making sure that, any changes are logged in a change order. But maybe part of that process is ensuring that whenever this happens, that's pushed out to the rest of the team as well. You really want to be making sure that you're speaking both to your audience, but speaking to your band as well. So, perfect example from playing. If my drummer doesn't know what I'm going to be doing next, or I've not communicated the next song in the set to that person, I can't really expect them to keep up. So just making sure that we're really over communicating as much as possible, both externally and internally. That's something that really helps in conjunction with those briefs. And guys, that last great point here that we've noticed has been really successful with a lot of different agencies in the internal sphere is just being consistent. Again, we know it's tough with the volume of work that's coming in, the amount of requests that we're constantly fielding, not to mention any sort of internal admin work that we have to do in our jobs. It can be tough to find a repeatable, consistent workflow. But I can promise you, doing what you can to kind of set that in place from the very beginning, and then being very consistent about that, it's going to do nothing but make your lives a lot easier. Perfect example of this would be one of the agencies that I've been working with in the past. Really didn't have too much of a workflow in place, and really, I guess for lack of a better term, they would have different workflows for different customers that come in. And I understand that there's going to be exceptions that have to be made for whomever's requesting that piece of work or for things like deadlines. But the issue that we run into is that when there isn't that consistency, when we start moving that project further down the pipeline, people don't really know what to expect. So are we going through a briefing phase? Are we going through an approval phase? Are we going through a scheduling and resourcing phase after that? After that's been done, and then are we kind of pushing out the various tasks that would make up that job only after those 3 steps have been completed? Now, if we don't have any real consistency there, people are always going to be left kind of scratching their head. So I know I've gotten this budget approved. I know that I have some buy-in from the stakeholders here, and I know that we've got a brief in the system, but am I scheduling this now, or am I actually going to create some sort of budget? Is there anything else that I need to do to push this job along? If we don't really have that workflow laid out, it makes it very hard for people to know what to expect. To come back to the example of the drummer, if that person can't keep up with the cadence that we're kind of setting on the front line, they've never played through the songs, they don't really know what the timing is, nothing's going to sound good. But if that consistency is built in from the beginning, that person's always going to be able to keep up. All right, folks, any questions so far? Okay, folks, just moving right along here. So just to do a quick review, 3 things that we can do to kind of get your team harmonizing, all singing the same song. Number 1 is getting that contract signed. So again, just to review here, folks, what we mean by that is, making sure that we have some sort of brief out there. And again, we've got those templates, so we'll send those through to you afterwards. And making sure that we have somebody signing off on those, the requester ideally, and then using that as a contract between yourself and the requester. So this is what I've asked for from the very beginning. This is what I expect out of this project. This is the resources we expect to pull in on that. Making sure that every party is kind of signed off on that and keeping that visible. It's just going to make it a lot easier for us to kind of hold both parties accountable. Communicating like a show promoter. So again, I can't stress this enough, folks. Over communication. So not just talking to the people that have requested the job, but making sure that the team internally who's working on that piece of work, making sure that they're looped in as well. And we're really just communicating consistently with those people. And the last but not least, making sure that your team knows what to expect. So again, making sure that we have that consistent workflow in place, making sure that we're being consistent with our briefs, making sure that our communication is consistent, really just making sure that there's as few surprises as possible. Again, if we're dealing with thousands of requests coming in over the course of the year, there are, of course, going to be moments that come up that are a little bit surprising, but we want to mitigate that as much as possible. So realistically speaking, following those first 2 steps, that should give us a really good head start in terms of that consistency, which kind of fills in point 3. All right, folks, so you've listened to me talk for the last 20 minutes or so. What I was hoping is that, if there's any sort of questions that come up throughout the course of this, you guys can throw them into that Slack channel. Or potentially if you want to unmute yourself on the GoToWebinar, you can ask through voice as well. And obviously, if we don't get to everything here, my email address will be included in the follow-up to this. So feel free to throw a couple of email questions as well. But I'll open the floor up to everybody. All right, well, Chris, I just wanted to kind of address your question a little bit more first. I'm not sure if we covered that enough for you initially, but what you're asking is the best way to get all stakeholders around the table at the brief stage. Again, kind of coming back to that, that brief, if we do have something that is set up from the very beginning, and we do have the expectation that we're not going to start work on this piece until we've got the necessary information that we need, that can sometimes be a great incentive to get those stakeholders around the table. So letting them know that, we really can't start this project until we have all the necessary information. And then being consistent about that, obviously. If we kind of let it slide a few times, people will take advantage of that fact, unfortunately. So just making sure that we have that policy in place right from the get-go and then being consistent about that. All right, Brooke, let me see what we got here. All right, so from Brooke, does your experience exhibit a better brief project request when completed by the internal team members or the customer? And how do most FunctionFox users do this? It's a great question. I always kind of lean towards the experience of actually having the account executive or that account manager speak with that person or speak with that customer, internal or external, in person. So, that could be over the phone, it might be through a kind of a chat feature, but kind of being able to fill that out with the person right there and then. That's a very effective way of doing it because, obviously there's going to be questions that person doesn't necessarily know the answers to. But when we've got an account executive or an account manager kind of in charge of that conversation, they might be able to probe a little bit deeper. Whereas if we just kind of left it up to that customer, what can often happen is that they really just kind of gloss over it. We have to understand that they're busy too, right? So sometimes if we're getting a little bit too detailed with the questions, it can make it difficult for them to kind of commit and go through the entire questionnaire. Now, that being said, where I have seen a lot of success in terms of people using briefs and having the customer actually fill it in is using something like a client portal with whatever system you guys are using. I know my experience is with Function Point, so I'm trying very hard not to speak about Function Point too much here. But what we use, we've actually got a customer portal. Now, with that portal, we'd have a brief template that would be used as that questionnaire. And we've got the ability to kind of pick and choose which questions that we're asking on that template are going to be required. So if we're very thoughtful about how we set those up, and we are using a tool that does give us the ability to make sure that some things are marked as absolutely required, we often see a lot of great results with that because the customer really can't submit the request until it's done. Really, it does kind of come back to that consistency, guys. So, if we are going to be using these brief templates, if we're using those outside of the system, maybe we set the expectation that we are having the account manager run through a few very required items with that customer, and then kind of filling in the blanks after that. If we are using a system that does give us the ability to communicate with that customer directly, we want to make sure that when we're setting our questions up, we're really picking and choosing which one of those are going to be the most vital to the job, and just making sure that those are being filled in. Brooke, I hope that answers your question. Perfect. All right, folks. Any other questions before we start wrapping things up here? All right, everybody. Thank you so much for your time today. Some great questions coming in, so that's much appreciated. Again, what we'll be doing, folks, is sending out a follow-up to this webinar. Included with that will be a couple of those brief templates that we've outlined before. And again, if there's any further questions about this stuff, feel free to shoot me a quick email. I'm always happy to talk to people from any of the agencies that we work with. But I'm certainly happy to talk to anybody working in the internal agency sphere. It's just always great to hear different feedback from people that I wouldn't normally get a chance to speak with. So please feel free to shoot those emails over. And again, thanks for your time, everybody, and we'll make sure we get that follow-up out to you all. Thank you so much.